Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my Chaos Golem of Maelstrom build. This is my once a league mandated minion build. I like to do minion builds at least once per league, just to get a feel for it, just to try to expand my knowledge. A lot of times there's things I learn from doing these builds that end up helping me in other areas of the game. Along with, it's just fun to try something new, try something I'm uncomfortable with, force myself into deep water that I might not necessarily know how to swim in, and just see what happens. Now, this character, I wanted to build around the new Transfigure gem that makes the Chaos Golem have a bigger and basically more powerful Chaos Dot Death Aura style attack. The interesting thing about this is it's a thing that doesn't stack. So normally when you have golem builds, you try to have a couple of extra golems for your primordial harmony damage scaling, and then you try to have a bunch of the same golems so you have multiple golems all dealing damage. But if I had two chaos golem, all it really does is gives me a bit better clear, but it doesn't really increase my single target. Two golems having their death aura both on the same enemy deals the damage of one golem with one death aura. It doesn't stack. Now, that being said, how good is the death aura? It's just kind of pretty middle of the road, I'd say. The clear, I think, is kind of bad. It's okay in the context of doing something like Harbinger or Abyss or bossing, but the second you want to do something like Legion, you're going to have a bad time. And as for the single target, I think it's decent for the budget, but doesn't really scale into any sort of really strong DPS build. It has a pretty low ceiling, I would say. It goes decently for your initial budget, and then after that, scaling it past that, it's going to be pretty expensive and not super rewarding or crazy high in scaling. Now, the idea behind the character was I was going to build into the Squire due to the Squire being cheap. This is part of what makes it really good for the price. Squire's really cheap this league. Next league, that might not be the case. What Squire allows us to do is make a nice, cheap multi-link wand and end up having like a pseudo 8.5 link, because you'll see we have efficacy and more damage on this thing, along with +2 support. So that's like 2.5 links there, and then you have your normal 6 link due to just having the Squire plus a one-hand weapon. Now, what does this end up meaning? It means we get a decent amount of damage links that are all pretty dang good. For example, the +2 support gives me an extra 2 levels with Empower. It's almost like having +2 gem levels somewhere else on the build. You add in something like Awakened Void Manipulation. This is very high value. That gives a level and a lot of chaos damage. You add in things like Awakened Minion damage. A lot of decent damage multiplier there and a level. You add in things like Controlled Destruction. Pretty good damage link. That also works with the Maelstrom. The Maelstrom scales with % damage increases or modifiers to spell damage. So I believe this works on the Chaos Golem's dot, as well as we have Ink AoE, which should work on the dot along with making it bigger. If you got a little bit lucky on the craft, you hit something like Ink AoE. I did that. I didn't want to end up using this because it would be expensive to replicate. You could end up going for Swift Affliction here for even more damage. Now, as for the wand craft, super simple. You just awaken Aura of Efficacy with more spell damage. Nothing really too complicated about that. And then all you need to do is annul off if you get an extra, if you don't have an open prefix, you have to annul off the prefix to craft +2 supports. Basically, it's going to cost you a couple Awakener orbs, but the bases should be pretty cheap, and it should be an easy craft all in all. When you get down to it, it's just a basically 3-stat item where you're guaranteeing 2 stats with Awakener orb. As far as I can tell, pretty straightforward. Hopefully should be easy to replicate. Now, as for everything else, when it comes to making a character on a budget, one of my favorite items is Atula's Hunger. The reason I like this is it allows you to have a bunch of bad gear. And what I mean by bad gear is gear that just doesn't have a lot of good stats. For example, if you had these gloves, but you had T1 life, that would be much harder to craft, much more expensive on the market. And that goes for basically all my rares. It essentially meant I could have rares that just had some okay suffixes. I could chuck them on and that would work just fine. So that's kind of what we have here. I have some mediocre Fractured Suppress rolls, which I bought for anywhere from 50C to 1 Divine, which is pretty much the price range of all my rares and my Stygian Belt and my Dragon Fang, all that stuff. Super cheap, and it works out pretty well. Speaking of Dragon Fang, this amulet right here, I really like this because it's something you can use on basically any build that is in meta. For example, I bought this perfectly divine 10 all res, 10 reservation for 20 chaos, and there were multiple that were one-off perfects for 20 chaos. Basically, there was a bunch of these, and it's just easy to grab something like this when you're doing an off-meta build. I love to throw it into characters like this, and it works great with the Tulas because it doesn't have a life mod anyways, and there you go. So that was the idea of getting some pretty cheap gear that had some decent bang for the buck. And then as for scaling the build, because we only need 1 Chaos Golem, it was easy to get extra Golems into the build. Now, I want to note something very powerful, and I think the most interesting thing I learned from this build is the Golem of Hordes allows you to get essentially 2 max golems into your build without investing into maximum golems. Essentially, it gives you the old anima stone without investing into anima stone and having the extra gems in your build. The way it works is, normally our maximum golems would be, like if I hover over this chaos golem, our maximum golems for this thing, it should say 3 max summon golems. And it's going to say that for my stone golem, and it's going to say that for my lightning golem. These are the golems that have the buffs I care about. So I didn't put Golem of Hordes on them. But the way it works is, when you have a Golem of Hordes where the maximum is 5, you can end up pushing your limit higher by saying, okay, I have 3 golems out here, but this golem can have up to 5 max of these. I'm going to summon a 4th with a Golem of Hordes for my flame golem and a Golem of Hordes for the 5th as the ice golem. The way this essentially works is, as long as you have Golem of Hordes gems, we're using that to summon your next 2 maximum gem or golems, you can push the limit up to 5 from 3 just because of having this gem in here. For example, if I had a golem build where I cared about the ice golem buff, the lightning golem buff, the flame golem buff, the stone golem buff, and the chaos golem buff, if I cared about all those buff effects, essentially what I could do is I could have a maximum of 5 golems in my character via an anima stone, elementalist, the golem commander node, stuff like that. I could have those 5 golems, and then I could have a Golem of Hordes carry-on golem and summon 2 of those, and that would allow me to get 7 golems on the field. So I would get 7 golems of buff effect from Elementalist, I'd get Primordial Bond giving me 70% damage per node, but I wouldn't actually have to have 2 max golems on my character. Just having 1 Golem of Hordes allows you to kind of push that limit, which I think is quite cool, and it's interesting for builds that aren't even basically, you don't have to be a golem build to take advantage of this. Like if you're an elementalist doing Primordial Bond and stuff like that, it can kind of work out. So I might look into that into future builds. Now, hopefully that gives you a good idea of what the character is. Essentially, outside of that, we have 72 suppress with lucky, which is around 90-ish% suppress. Along with, we do have a bone offering that affects ourselves. So we have 69, 64 block with roomies that goes to 75, 70. So we have good block, along with suppress, along with determination aura from this chonker turtle right here. And then we mix in things like Arctic armor for freeze immune, shock immune from Tempest Shield, chill immune from boots. Ends up feeling pretty decent, I would say. I should also note we are using the Primalist Ascendancy essentially for the charms for Onslaught by having all of our guys near us, and a bit of mana regen to help us sustain. And then we have ourselves some offering effect on our other 2, which helps us get that block. And then some res, which I think is just kind of overcapping us. We don't really just more res than we need, but it's enough to maybe help our minions cap their res along with capping my res. I don't know. It's just some cheap charms that I thought worked well in the build. Now, let's give you guys a little showcase of what this build looks like while doing a map. Oh, before I get into the map, I want to say the Spectres I'm using. I'm using Oak. I think it's the perfect Warlord for endurance charges and vitality. I'm using the perfect Guardian Turtle. He gives PDR and determination, and he's tanky. And I'm using the Hulking Mixed Creation, which gives 100% increased damage to constructs, which my golems are construct minions. Now, these guys are relatively cheap. I did at one point have a level 21 Spectre. I tried out the Grace Spectre, but he was kind of squishy. He died on me a couple times. I tried out the Judgmental Spirit with the Recover Minion Life on Minion Death, which worked decently in Ubers, but that guy died as well. You can try out different things. Ultimately, I think it's fine if you just have a level 20 Spectre gem here and just have these 3 Spectres, because these 3 guys work pretty dang well. Now, let's go ahead and get into a little map showcase of what I'm talking about. We have a Mesa map here with Hunter, and I'll give you a look at what this character can do in a mapping scenario. I will showcase Harbinger specifically because that's what I was running, and I think I unspec'd it. I unspec'd out of, I was running Harbinger, but I think I unspec'd out of it because I needed to spec Ubers, so I need a lot of points to do Ubers. As for Ubers, this character did 6 out of 7. Most of them went pretty well, except for Exarch. Specifically, Exarch was hard because the minions, they end up blowing up balls next to you. Those balls, when they explode, have AoE. So essentially what that means is the golem or my specters would go hit a ball, and that would mean I would then die because they would they'd blow it up next to me, and I don't really know how to play around that. That's something I'm gonna have to learn and get better at. I will say for the clear on this character, it's not great. You'll notice when I summon the minion, or when I convocate the minion next to me, he ends up killing everything like in the near vicinity, but his AI to go around and go kill other things isn't great. That's why on this build, if I was doing it, I would be doing it to do content like Harbinger, like Abyss, where you just care about having your guy on a specific area to fight. For example, there should be at least one Harbinger in this map, kind of showcase it. See if I can find it. We'll just look around for it real quick. I mean, you can still run around and it does okay because it keeps popping on top of you, but it doesn't have the AoE like a Sentinel of Radiance, for example. So what content I like with this build is things like Harbinger. So Harbinger, he's going to spawn all of his guys in a concentrated location. I don't really have to move the Golem, and it'll be fine for clearing out these guys as they spawn. So it works well in things like Harbinger or Abyss, but it's not going to work well in something like a Legion. So there is some pros and cons to the clear, because the Chaos Dot is pretty small. I'd say that the biggest limitation of this Golem is his just AoE isn't very big. If it was like the Sentinel of Radiance, it'd feel amazing, but since it's not like the Sentinel of Radiance, it's kind of just mid-tier. It has decent boss damage. You see that has a T16 boss, killed it pretty fast. We'll see how we do with this Conquer here. I think we're in the range of around 3 to 7 million. I don't really know. Depends on Wither stacks, I think. We are inflicting Wither with a Cultist. I stole the Withering Presence node. Ultimately, this is just more of a quality of life thing. It isn't really min-maxed. If you're going to try to go for like better single target, you should do something like Wither Totems. You should lose a bit of quality of life by losing your faster casting, losing your faster attacks. You can do stuff like that, and then instead of having the Withering Presence, you have 2 more Primordial Harmonies. So you would upgrade your damage, you'd apply the Wither faster, but you'd sacrifice quality of life. I don't like to sacrifice quality of life, so I went with Withering Presence. It was cheap, and it was a chill way to apply some Wither stacks. So you can see, damage ain't half too bad, and I think for the budget, this character is pretty solid. It's got a decent defensive kit, got Vitality, it has some okay regen from the Stone Golem, it has Suppress, it has some decent block, it has an okay Fizz mitigation between my Fizz taken as on my gear pieces, and my PDR from Endurance Charges, my PDR from the Turtle and Determination, and the less damage taken from Arctic Armor. I like the character, I think it's pretty chill, I think it's good for the budget, but it's pretty rough on clear, and it doesn't really scale much past this. This is just a character I want to throw together, try on a little bit of a budget, see what we could do in this league where everything's so expensive. I think 25 Divines is relatively cheap, but maybe even that is still too expensive for some people. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video I have on the Chaos Golem. Maybe gets you thinking about making some Golem builds of your own, or maybe you found that tech about the Golem before. It's interesting that it just gives you another 2 maximum on top of the amount of Golems you normally get. I'm definitely going to reincorporate that into future builds, especially maybe looking into some Elementalist League starts, like for example an Elementalist Righteous Fire League start. Definitely pretty tempting for me to do with this thing I just learned from this character. That's why I like doing these builds, is it gives me something. I try out different things and it forces me to learn, and I have something now that I'm going to use in a future build, and I'm pretty glad about it. Anyways, this is the Chaos Golem of Maelstrom. Hopefully you enjoyed this video showcasing it. As always, thanks for watching. Take care and peace out.